In today's cultural civil war, many people are being maligned, accused of being associated with groups they aren't actually affiliated with. If you follow This American Life, the podcast, then you'll know that recently Lacey Green and Chris Ray Gun appeared on the podcast. In response to the tweet, many people said that This American Life was pandering to or supporting neo-Nazis. That's right. It's gone from Lacey Green being a bad ally to supporting anti-feminism to now being a neo-Nazi. And I'm sure any rational human being would know that no, Lacey Green is not a neo-Nazi. In fact, she is probably as far from neo-Nazi as you can probably get. But now something else has popped up. A Stanford professor is now being accused of creating a terrorist organization because of his college anti-fascist network. The Guardian recently ran an op-ed from the Stanford University professor, but before I get into that, I want to give a shout out to today's sponsor, all of you. If you haven't already, go to patreon.com/Timcast and become a patron today. There are many different tiers to choose from. Most notably is Tier 1. At $10 per month, you get access to behind-the-scenes photos and videos, bonus videos and commentary. So please consider becoming a patron at whatever level you feel comfortable today to help support my work. From The Guardian, U.S. University's opinion section. I'm a Stanford professor accused of being a terrorist. McCarthyism is back. David Palumbo Liu. He starts by saying, today anyone can be accused of anything without basis in fact or evidence, and that accusation can be instantly trumpeted over the airwaves, unchecked by any journalistic standard. That is the painful lesson I have had to learn this year. As a scholar, activist working on the issues such as sexual assault, Palestine, and anti-fascism, I am used to receiving abusive messages and being publicly maligned. Now, however, attacks on me have reached troubling new heights. Last month, the Stanford Review, a right-wing publication co-founded by Peter Thiel and based on my university campus, wrote that I have helped set up an organization that is undeniably a chapter of a terrorist group and demanded my resignation. Their article was picked up by groups like Jihad Watch, Campus Fix, Campus Reform, Fox and Friends, and other right-wing media outlets. The organization I belong to is called the Campus Anti-Fascist Network. We advocate for organized resistance to fascist violence on campus and for educating our communities and others as to the nature of fascism today. We claim solidarity with a proud tradition of anti-fascism dating back to the early 20th century. Fascism sucks. I think most Americans oppose fascism because, for one, it's authoritarian, it's illiberal. We, as rational, normal Americans, don't like restrictions on freedom of thought and expression. In fact, it is enshrined in our First Amendment, the right to gather, the right to protest, the right to free expression, the right to a free press. It is the First Amendment. That's how important it is to all of us. And why would the average American, if not almost all Americans, oppose fascism? As I just stated, it is authoritarianism. And we do not like people telling us what to do. But there is a lot to unpack here, so let's look at the Stanford Review story from 25 days ago. Antifa thugs find a champion and leader in Stanford professor. A new class of violent thugs prowls our streets, donning black clothes, masks, and red bandanas. The so-called anti-fascist movement, or Antifa, issues threats and commits acts of violence, intimidation, and vandalism against those it brands fascists. The group represents one of the most extreme elements in the intensifying political turmoil of the past few years. Fringe figures such as white nationalists are by no means the only targets of Antifa violence. At college campuses across the country, Antifa has disrupted lectures by mainstream conservatives and libertarians, often brutally assaulting event organizers and attendees. At UC Berkeley in February 2017, Antifa caused $100,000 in damages in an attempt to derail a scheduled appearance by Milo Yiannopoulos, violently punching, kicking, beating, and pepper spraying Trump supporters. At the University of Utah, Antifa operatives stockpiled firearms and viciously attacked attendees of Ben Shapiro's campus lecture. The Department of Homeland Security and FBI have designated these actions by Antifa as domestic terrorist violence. Like other recognized terrorist organizations, Antifa is a non-state entity that employs violence against civilians to advance a political agenda. This article cites The Independent, an article that reads, Antifa U.S. security agencies label group domestic terrorist. Department of Homeland Security has reportedly been warning about growing threat of violence between left-wing anarchists and right-wing nationalists since early 2016. And I'm not going to go into the whole article, but suffice to say, U.S. security officials have classified the left-wing group Antifa as domestic terrorists, confidential documents have revealed. The fact that Antifa has been deemed domestic terrorists is not new, and it's been widely reported, and apparently there are documents to support this. And that being said, The Independent is considered a left-wing publication too, so I think it is a safe assessment that everyone of all political alignments can agree on that the FBI did classify them this way. Now, as to whether or not you agree with the FBI or Homeland Security, it's entirely up to you. The fact is, they did this. Let's move on. The article that criticizes Palumbo Lu also says, while many students understandably take offense at Palumbo Lu's extreme views, he certainly has every right to promote his ideas in the classroom. However, Palumbo Lu recently took his extremism beyond the realm of ideas. In August 2017, Palumbo Lu, along with Purdue University professor Bill Mullen, founded the Campus Anti-Fascist Network. The group was founded to serve as a big tent for anyone committed to fighting fascism. This article is a bit hyperbolic. It's very hyperpartisan, and it's very difficult to suss out exactly what Antifa is or who is or is not Antifa. Now, I know the FBI and DHS have said it's a terrorist organization, but it's not an organization. Antifa is a loose-knit group of people who share similar and sometimes conflicting ideologies, but for the most part, oppose the far right. Now, keep in mind, it is not just about fighting fascism, it is about what they describe to be the far right, and I'll get into that in a second. But I think it's fair to point out that just because a Stanford professor supports civil disobedience doesn't mean he is actually advocating for violence or terrorism. Though many people agree that Antifa is in favor of using violence against those it opposes because we have seen them do this time and time again, it is still hard to say who is and who is not Antifa. Now, this professor has created a group, the Campus Anti-Fascist Network. So at what point do we say that simply protesting fascism makes you Antifa? There is a big difference between someone who wears all black and commits acts of violence and vandalism and attacks those, and someone who simply wants to be an anti-fascist. There is the brand of Antifa, and then there is simply anti-fascist. They are actually different things. One of the things I take issue with is that many people often try to play the, if you oppose fascism, then you are Antifa, and that's simply not true. I think, as I mentioned, most people in this country oppose fascism. Fascism sucks, and I think most people in this country would fight against it. But we are not facing fascism. There seems to be a confusion as to what fascism is. At its root, it's authoritarian nationalism, but there is a deep history to fascism. Now, the reason why I'm bringing this up is that according to many people within what they describe the anti-fascist movement, it is not simply about fighting fascism. Yes, you heard me correctly. They call themselves Antifa, which is short for anti-fascist, but they explicitly say it is about more than that. From the book Antifa, the Anti-Fascist Handbook by Mark Bray, there's a passage that reads, "At the heart of the anti-fascist outlook is a rejection of the classical liberal phrase incorrectly ascribed to Voltaire that, 'I disapprove of what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it.' After Auschwitz and Treblinka, anti-fascists committed themselves to fighting to the death the ability of organized Nazis to say anything. Thus, anti-fascism is an illiberal politics of social revolutionism applied to fighting the far right, not only literal fascists." Now, what is the far right? I don't know. There are many far-right libertarians who are anarchists, anarcho-capitalists. Does that mean that they're fighting them too? The point is, the anti-fascist movement, as described in the handbook by Mark Bray, who is certainly not the spokesperson for anti-fascism, but you can see into the minds, you can see some insight into how they think. It is not just about fascism. It is about the far right. Their words, not mine. They also say that they are illiberal. Again, their description, not mine. And what does illiberal mean? Illiberal is defined as opposed to liberal principles restricting freedom of thought or behavior. Illiberal and anti-democratic policies. And once again, we can see, thus, anti-fascism is an illiberal politics of social revolutionism applied to fighting the far right. So again, I want to make clear, Mark Bray certainly is not a leader of Antifa, because there is no leader. It's a loose knit of individuals with similar and sometimes conflicting ideologies, but the one thing they all agree on is opposing the far right. And we can see some insight into the minds of at least how some of these people think. they self-describe as illiberal, meaning they believe in restricting freedom of thought and behavior. But now let's look at another passage. An anti-fascist outlook has no tolerance for intolerance. It will not agree to disagree. To those who argue that this would make us no better than Nazis, we must point out that our critique is not against violence, incivility, discrimination, or disrupting speeches in the abstract, but against those who would do so in the service of white supremacy, heteropatriarchy, class oppression, and genocide. The point here is not tactics, it is politics. White supremacy, that's a bad thing. Class oppression, that's also a bad thing. Genocide's a really bad thing. In terms of class oppression, we pride ourselves as Americans in creating upward mobility that a lot of countries don't have, or at least didn't have a long time ago. Now, the heteropatriarchy thing is very specific, and I don't really know how even they define it because the definition is kind of changing, but I'm going to leave that one out and just say, certainly, many of us agree that the things they list are bad and we would oppose them too. However, what they are saying here is that they're not criticizing the use of violence, discrimination, or oppression themselves, just when the people they disagree with use these tactics. So let's make one thing clear. According to this book, they self-describe as being illiberal. They don't agree with freedom of thought or freedom of behavior, and they don't disagree with using violence. They only disagree with violence and oppression when it comes from people they don't like. So think about what that would lead to. If this group ever gained power in any substantive form, because yes, not all of these people are anarchists, some of them are communists who do want some form of government, they would be violent and discriminatory and oppressive and restrict freedom of thought and behavior. This is not a good group of people, and these are not politics the average American would want to support. Using their own words, that they're not criticizing the use of violence or that they are illiberal, we can take a look at authoritarian. The definition of authoritarian is favoring or enforcing strict obedience to authority, especially that of the government, at the expense of personal freedom. So there has been a debate among the left and the right as to whether Antifa is actually authoritarian. And there is to an extent still a debate, but I would say that a group that doesn't oppose violence and discrimination and does not agree with freedom of thought or freedom of behavior is in fact authoritarian, because if they're willing to use violence and oppression and discrimination against those because of what they think, and they don't believe that people have a right to freedom of behavior or thought, that would inherently make them authoritarian. And lastly, the more extreme attribution, terrorism. Terrorism is defined as the unlawful use of violence and intimidation, especially against civilians, in the pursuit of political aims. According to the Antifa Handbook, and many statements from people who align with the anti-fascist movement, they are willing to use violence against those they disagree with. They do not agree with freedom of thought. This inherently does make them a terrorist movement. Now, I don't want to say organization because it's not really organized. There are certainly certain sects, certain groups that have organized themselves to a certain degree, but Antifa as a whole is not very organized. You could say then it is a terroristic ideology. The idea that they can restrict someone's freedom of thought and behavior based on what they believe, and that they have a right to use discrimination, oppression, violence, and disruption against them. This, in my opinion, would make them terrorists. But it's not about what my opinion is. The Department of Homeland Security and the FBI has already labeled this group as such. The important takeaway from all of this is that the ongoing cultural civil war is not about left versus right, though it is framed that way many times. It is about the authoritarian versus the libertarian. Because as we see in the Antifa Handbook, they're not criticizing the use of violence, discrimination, and disruption. They're only criticizing it when it's used by their political opponents in the far right. There are certainly useful idiots and ignorant people who are supporting both sides. And I'm not sure what the knowledge or intention is of this professor from Stanford, but he's certainly fallen into a category of people that are often aligned with terrorists, like actually aligned with terrorists. And whether or not the Stanford Review article is correct, you have to realize that when you step into the fray, when you organize anything, you will be attacked by the opposition. And this is why Lacey Green is now apparently a neo-Nazi, because she stepped over the line, she walked towards the fire, and that is against the rules of today's cultural civil war. So let me know what you think in the comments below, and we will keep the conversation going. I am about to get on a plane and head to one of these events where, well, we'll see what happens, and I'll have more information as it arises, so stay tuned tomorrow. I'll be on Twitter at Timcast, and there should be some relatively breaking news. Keep in mind, all of this fighting between Antifa and the right, whatever you want to call it, these are small groups of people. And as we see time and time again, the average American cares more about Season 2 of Westworld, or more importantly, Avengers Infinity War, which gets way more views on its trailer than any of this nonsense gets. Keep in mind, these are small fringe groups. These are not, necessarily going to change the course of human history, but it's important to keep an eye on these things, and for the time being, these are the stories that I will be covering. So again, thank you all so much for watching. Stay tuned, and I will see you tomorrow at 4 p.m.